Well, as some of you may have realised, yesterday was Christmas. Did you sleep, anyone? Okay. So, just before we started doing stuff and getting everything ready for celebrations and whatnot, Michael leans over to me and goes, "Dad, why is it called Boxing Day?" Now, being the quick-witted father that I am, I said, "Well, see, son, if you don't behave, all those presents that Santa Claus brought you, we have to box them up and send them back. That's why it's called Boxing Day." But in actual fact, the real reason it's called Boxing Day is because back in those days when people used to do that sort of thing, the carolers would go around to all the houses and would sing the Christmas carols to people's houses. And they'd carry with them a box, like a donation box. You put your money in to say thank you. And then after the Christmas celebrations, they would then rip open the boxes to take the money out and give to the needy. Hence what it's called Boxing Day. Hang on a second, technical difficulties, I'll be right back. And we're back. So, as I said, just told my story about Mike and his question. It seems that there's always questions that need answers. Happy holidays, everyone. Holidays is a time when we get together with family and friends. And indubiously, because we have a religious background, we always get questions and statements coming up. The real question is though, how do we respond? Now, for those of you who were listening the other week, you'll remember that I told you that Peter had already told us how we should respond. In all things, revere Christ as Lord. But always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Keeping a clear conscience that those who speak maliciously against your good behaviour in Christ may be ashamed for their slander. It's important that when these questions are asked that we remember that every question has a questioner. Most of the time these questions come from either misinformation or lack of knowledge. Sometimes people will get aggressive, and when they get aggressive, it's usually because of a personal or perceived hurt in their life. So before we answer, we have to, first of all, ask. And most importantly, we have to listen. So today's going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to lie too much on this. Instead, what I'm going to do is going to answer some of these questions. I haven't got time to cover the full in-depth of it. Let's just have a bit of a play. Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion as well as many other atheistic books, stated, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous, proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." It's pretty sad if that's how he feels. But, believe it or not, there's a lot of people that feel the same way. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to ask. The easiest question to ask is, well, what do you mean? Well, in Deuteronomy, God tells Joshua to genocide all the Canaanites. Even worse, is the psalmist says that blessed is he who smashes the babies against the rocks. Doesn't this show how evil the Bible is? So then we need to ask more questions. Have you ever considered that it's just misinterpretation? See, before you go and interpret the Bible, you have to stop. For most people that quote these things out of the Bible, they've read a snippet that someone's posted saying how evil the Bible is. I've told you before, and I'll tell you again, and I'll keep telling you, there's no verses in the Bible. 66 books, 40 authors over 1,500 years, all pointing to one truth. There is no verses. They were added in, I think it was around about 500 AD, as a reference, so that we could quickly turn to something and read a section. That's the key point, is that you need to read the whole section. So stop. Have a look at the situation at the time. So if we have a look at Deuteronomy, what was happening there is the Israelites who had been under oppression in Israel were moving into Canaan. Now the Canaanites were a very, very evil people. There's not a country in this world, I don't think, that would intercept and go and attack them if they were doing the sort of things that they were doing today. They would take a baby and they would place it on the altar. This altar was a statue of the goddess of fertility, and it would get so hot that the children would melt before they even touched the metal. And as the mothers cried there, as the screaming was going on, they would play the drums loud. This is historical fact. So were the Israelites right to go and destroy that and end it? Probably. But putting all that aside, what we need to remember is that Joshua was a military commander. And one of the things that you learn as a military commander is that definitions have meanings. For us, the definition of destroy, which I was ordered many times to do, wasn't necessarily to completely obliterate everyone, but was to render them useless, so they could no longer practice what they were practicing. So when God said to go and destroy the Canaanites, he was saying, make them utterly useless so they can no longer worship their gods, pull down all their temples, destroy all their altars, obliterate that stuff, so that then they can follow the right way and learn how to worship the Lord God Almighty correctly. What about Psalm 137? Well, the situation behind that is this is a psalm of lament. It's written after a town was destroyed and conquered and they'd been taken into exile. You need to understand the type of literature that these things are. Joshua, well, that was a military decree. Completely different to a story, completely different to something that you would read in the newspaper. The psalmist was a psalm of lament. Most of it is allegorical or analogy. Next thing is you need to understand the object. Believe it or not, 90% of the Bible isn't actually written to you. It's written to a people that existed many years ago in a culture that was far different from ours, and a different understanding of how the world works and what life in it was like. I won't read it out, but Psalm 137 is pretty sad. And it talks about how the town's been captured and they've seen all these atrocities happen to their own. And instead of going and taking vengeance, it says no. Blessed is he who waits and allows the Lord to take vengeance. For the Lord will send someone who the Lord will bless, who will return those atrocities back onto them. And it describes some of the things that were done. But it's not saying that God's happy with those that smash people across with stones and that sort of stuff. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is God will bless those that avenge for his sake when he sends them. I said before, this is a piece of the Bible that you're reading. Is it prescriptive or is it descriptive? Everyone's favourite, Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper, etc., etc. It wasn't written to us. There are many of us that will not prosper. Does that mean the Bible was wrong in line? No. It was written to the Jews that were going into exile. God was telling them through Jeremiah that as they go into exile, Don't be mournful, don't drag your feet. Do the best that you can do and uphold everyone. Work towards prospering the people that you were captive for, and in return you will prosper. And indeed they did. Who was second in charge of Babylon? Daniel. Did he at all talk against his king? No. And you got things like Esther, the queen. All these people did exactly what the Lord said, and they prospered. That doesn't mean that we can't take something out of that. The Lord knows the plans that He's got for you, and the Lord wants you to have the best things in life. But the world is very different. I guarantee you no one stands up here and says, oh, you should read this verse. Jeremiah 43:11. I, the Lord your God, will destroy you and wipe you from the face of the earth because you have not listened to me. That was said to the exiles that went to Egypt, because instead of following God and doing what He said, they decided, we know better, we know best. I won't go into all the other stuff that he says because there's plenty of other ones there. But as I said, if you actually go through and read the book from cover to cover, it's very different to when you take a snippet out. Christopher Hitchens is our next guest. Religion poisons everything. As well as a menace to civilization, it has become a threat to the human survival. So once again, what's the first thing that we have to ask? What do you mean? Most people that quote this, they're very quick to say, what about the Crusades? That was just war. Think of all the horrible things that were done. But what about the Spanish Inquisition? Or even the infighting between Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland? Well, have you ever considered, at the start of this whole thing called Christianity, when the Romans were in charge, there was no welfare net. So, when you died, no one cared. You were just left out to the side. It was the Christians that actually started doing things, such as looking after the widows and the orphans. The Christians is what brought all these good things in. In fact, it was St. Augustine who developed the idea of a just war. In this, he realised that all people were created in the image of God, and so everyone had to be treated with justice and respect, regardless of who they are, what they believed in, all that sort of stuff. Everyone had to be treated fairly. And so instead of saying that people should just be left and once you conquer a town, you just destroy everything and move on, he said you had to look after your prisoners of war. You had to feed them. You had to take care of those that were left destitute because the place had been burnt down. In actual fact, the First Crusade was a just war. The Muslims had come in and invaded Europe. They burnt down villages and whatnot, and the just reaction was to push them back, prevent the invaders, and go and release the captives that had been taken. Now, unfortunately, subsequent crusades were a little bit misled. It was usually because they were trying to free the Promised Land, because that was a three-way trade route, and it was worth a lot of money. And as happens with all religions and all things around the world, people will twist something and say, God wills it. We have to do this because it's God's command. And they'll twist verses because they don't read the whole lot, they just take one little piece and say, well, hey, we're told to eradicate these people, so let's do it. But the truth is that it's only recent years that anyone's actually looked at the Crusades and said, oh, how horrible was that to the Muslims? The Muslims themselves, they think it was a laughable event. It was an absolute failure. We lost more casualties than them, and we didn't succeed anyway. According to the Encyclopedia of Wars, out of all the 1,763 wars that have been recorded to have been fought, only 123, or if you prefer percentage, 6.98, less than 7%, actually were based on religion. So that covers the war. What about the Spanish Inquisition? Did you ever consider the Spanish Inquisition lasted about 350 years? In that time, it's been accounted to somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people tortured and killed. Let's assume the later, 5,000. In my books, that's about 6,000 too many. But actual historical records show that the Inquisition prisons and the prisoners in them were treated a lot better than those in the secular prisons of the day. In fact, there's several recordings where people were blaspheming and saying, no, God's not real, God's not real. See, I've got to go to the Inquisition now. It'll be dealt with them. Because the fact of the matter is that when you come under a ruler such as Christ, regardless of how ruthless you may be, there is a limit. And for most of these people, when they said, yes, I repent, I believe, they were either set free or they were given the mercy of a quick death. In the secular prisons, there was no such thing. Let's think about it. Religion causes more poison than anything else. Have you heard of a man named Stalin? He was a leader of the USSR for 25 years, and in that time, 20 million Soviets were killed, one way or another. He was responsible for their deaths. He didn't do it because of atheism told him to, but because he was an atheist, he made his own rules. He had no moral compass to guide him. Whatever he and his society thought was right, it was right. And in 1 week alone, over 15,000 people died at his hand. That's more than 3 times the Spanish Inquisition in total. Oh, it doesn't explain the infighting. Catholics are always going against Protestants, blah, blah, blah. North Ireland was first in disputation, so argued and fought over, in 1169. Henry VIII declared England as Protestant in 1532. As a result, the Protestants moved then into Ireland. You see, the fact of the matter is that the fighting and the arguments over in Ireland, it was never really about Catholicism or Protestant. It's just that infallible human beings drag religion into it and start pointing the finger. Oh, those silly Catholics, they're doing this. Oh, those dopey Protestants, they're doing that. But now let's talk about something that most of us have probably had a conversation or two over in the last week or so. Christianity stole Christmas. So let's see who's been listening. What's the first thing that we need to ask? What do you mean? Very quickly by, have you ever considered? The actual documented history says that this claim is just plain false. It's time for a bit of a history lesson. St. Nicholas. He was orphaned at a young age. He had rich parents, he loved Jesus and loved all the stories that he had been told. He didn't know what to do with his money because he was so young. So he used to go around and throw it in through the windows of the less fortunate. And quite often they would have their shoes and stockings hanging by the fire to dry off. And he'd try to land it in there. It was a bit of a game for him. One story said that there was a merchant who got into a bit of debt, had 3 young daughters. And to pay off the debts in those days, you either paid the money, and if you couldn't pay, well then you handed over your children. Daughters were preferable, because he could sell them into the different industries that were around at the time. He found out about this, and so he put enough money for the dowry for the first daughter into a stocking. And so the father was able to marry her off. The next night, he did the same to the next one. On the third night, the father clued on and waited up and called him. And he said, look, I don't want anyone to know that I'm doing this. Here's the money, the daughters are now free. Just don't tell anyone. As news does, it quickly spreads. It's for this reason he's always shown with 3 golden orbs. Anyone seen any of those around the Christmas tree? The 3 golden orbs represented the sacks of gold that he would throw in through the window. Interestingly enough, he's actually the patron saint of pawnbrokers. He goes on and he moves around and he travels, and when he was in the city of Myra, he was made the bishop. And you understand that at this time, there's this guy called Diocletian. And he was a very, very not so nice emperor. And he was just jailing all the bishops so he could feed them to lions for sport. One of those guys. So, a Christian walks in. You're a preacher. Guess what? You're the other bishop. No, that's all right. He can do it. Anyway, St. Nicholas, he was dubbed the Bishop of Myra and was jailed, waiting execution. As he was waiting execution, Diocletian had some health issues. And he's actually the first and only emperor that abdicated. This is the guy that said, worship me, I am a god. He got so sick that he could no longer even rule the people in his own palace. How's that irony? So, a new emperor was born, or a new emperor was announced. He quickly died, and the next one after him quickly died. And then we had a bit of a fight, because the Roman Empire was split into 4. One of the people that was named an emperor was Constantine. Two of the other emperors quickly fell, quick succession. And the last one was taking a little bit longer. And during one of the most deciding battles in all of history, he had a vision. And he looked up and he heard a voice say, "In this sign conquer." A bit hard to see, but you see there it's a cross. And it's a cross with an X and a P-looking shape. This is actually the Latin first 2 letters of Christ. The P is actually grow, sounds rural. Anyway, he went through and he put that sign on all the shields of his men, and they won. He became the sole emperor of Rome. People argue that this may have been a political thing and whatnot, but if you actually have a look at it, something happened to him that day. His philosophy, everything about him changed like that. A change that only one person could bring. He went on to write something called the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan was something that said that all people could worship whoever they felt was right to worship without any recourse. So now the Christians couldn't be persecuted, but neither could any other religion for that matter. Finally, there was something called religious freedom. Unfortunately, with that, things go into a bit of chaos, and he was forced to organise something called the Council of Nicaea. The main objective there was to eradicate something called Arianism, which was a false gospel. Well, let's get back to St. Nicholas. See, St. Nicholas was a bit of a fiery preacher. He fought against something that was called baby exposure. So what the Romans would do is when a baby was born, is they'd present it to the husband, or the father I should say, and place it at his feet naked. If the husband accepted the child, he'll take it up, and that would be one of his children. If he refused, the child was then placed in a basket and put outside and left to die. The Christians were going around and collecting these babies. It's one of those good things that they did. The person who came after Constantine actually wrote, "It's so despicable, these Christians, they are so lovely that it's bringing chaos into our ordered world." But he very much so denounced Arianism, and in particular Arius, and it's even said that he was deflocked because he turned around and slapped him in the face and said, "How dare you demark the name of Christ?" As a result, he was one of the bishops that assisted in the Nicene Creed. The Orthodox keeps holding St. Nicholas in high esteem. He's done a lot of things. They claim these calm storms, and he raised children from the dead. And he's also the patron saint of sailors and children. Anyway, as happens to all, he died. And because he was so esteemed, they built a church at his gravesite to house his bones. As the Muslims were rising and taking over Turkey, back then called Asia Minor, they were destroying shrines and temples, especially those made out to prophets and saints. So as a result, in Italy, they built this Baliste, I think they call it, in Bari, as the Ballistica of St. Nicholas. They moved the bones there. And to remember him, on every Xmas, remember X actually means Christ, so it's not crossing it out as some people claim, it's actually because that was the symbol for Christ. They'll then share gifts of gold to remember the good deeds that St. Nicholas had done. And very shortly, because the Roman Empire was the way it was, it spread. Now, we'll jump forward about 1,000 years. Martin Luther, one of the leaders of the Reformation, he said that all gifts come from God. The child, Christ, is the gift that we celebrate at Christmas. What's interesting is that if you translate child Christ into German, Chris Kringle. So no, it wasn't some Norse mythology, as some people claim. The Reformation was a good thing. It brought a lot of freedoms. But as with most things, some people tend to take it just a little bit too far and enter the Puritans. The Puritans were saying that Christmas was a bit of an idol worship thing. It was all money, gift, take. So they outlawed it. However, the Dutch continued this tradition, and when they settled in the US, or what's now known as the US, the Americas, they occupied and were the dominant people to occupy New York. You see, the Dutch considered St. Nicholas's visit like a mini day of judgment. Who had come from the celestial city, heaven, riding on a white horse, just like Jesus, with his elves, the angels, to judge the children, us, good or bad. Chris Kringle wasn't the nicest of people. You see, to the Dutch, if you were bad, he would bag you up, stick you on his sleigh, and take you and give you to the Muslims for slavery. The Dutch boys used to go to sleep with pocket knives, so that if they got caught, they could cut their way out of the bag and get away. But if you were good, you got the presents, and everyone tried to be good and everyone ended up getting presents. I don't know how many actually got taken away, but... Which brings us to our next character, Santa Claus. You see, the name Santa Claus actually comes from Sinterklaas, which is a short for Sinter Nicolaus, which is the Dutch version of Saint Nicholas. See, artists would depict Santa Claus, or Sinterklaas, in Dutch clothing. So, not that big red suit. No, that was something that Coca-Cola introduced. Because Coca-Cola wanted to sell more Coke. This guy's big and jolly. Let's get him to sell it. And hence, the man in the big red suit was born. Well, that's all well and good, but what about the day? It's just winter solstice, isn't it? Well, actually, no, winter solstice is actually the 22nd of December. But let's run with your argument for just a little bit. Do you remember the other week we were talking about how Zacharias was visited? Zacharias is believed to have been visited on the 25th of September. How do we get that date? Well, if you have a look at the story recorded in Luke, and remember Luke was a historian who got his information from eyewitnesses, Zacharias had this meeting during the time of, I think it's Abijah. Now that means not very much to us because we're not Jewish, but if you go and have a look at Jewish culture, there were different families. The family of Abijah was meant to be working on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which doesn't happen to be September, around about the 25th. You have to look into the Talmud and all these other Jewish writings to get that information, but just take my word for it. So now from that, we go 6 months later, where Mary's visited. And remember, Mary's cousin Elizabeth was already 6 months pregnant. So that gives us March 25th. So now if we plus 9 months onto March 25th, where does that land us? December 25th. Hence, the Western churches celebrate it on the 25th. What's interesting though is that you realise that the Orthodox Church, they haven't had Christmas yet. That's not until the 6th of January. And there's a bit of a divide between the Orthodox Church and the Western churches. And so in an effort to combine the two and join everyone and get some more harmony happening between the churches, they celebrated it all 12 days. On the 12th day of Christmas. What's really interesting is that these were known as the holy days. So as I started saying, you want to say happy holidays instead of happy Christmas? Go for it. Happy holidays. You see, all things point to the gospel. All things point to the truth of God and his gracious gift. Charlemagne said that all things tell us of God, and he sparked what was known as the Carolingian Renaissance. This was a time where we have a look at history, we have all these beautiful paintings and works of art and science, and the world was flourishing. That's because of his observation that you can see God in everything. Science, philosophy, history, politics, even the current affairs that we see all point to the one truth, and that is Jesus. Human beings continually rebel against God in any way that they can. See, the adversary helps by spilling these lies and deceptions. And even though God is perfect in justice and we all deserve to be punished, 2,000 years ago, he came in the form of a human. He lived a perfect life, and he took on our punishment for us, freely, so that we may live. An important thing to remind your family and friends at this Christmas time is that he'll never leave any of us behind. As we move on and we go visit family and friends in this holiday season, these questions come up. Don't be afraid to talk the truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth and the life, and the truth will set you free. The worst thing about churches is that it's full of hypocrites and humans. But that's the point. The point is that we can't do this on our own. No one can. But we don't have to work to earn this. We have to accept the gracious gift and He will work in us. If you feel that you want prayer, then by all means, very shortly we'll all pray. You can come up and have prayer. If you want to talk more about anything I've talked about, I'm an open book. Let's go for it. I think last time I spent nearly an hour sitting there talking to someone. Otherwise, time's your own. We're going to have some fellowship up the back. Enjoy. And God bless. Have a great day.